Welcome to Pandora. I'm going to show you how to create this awesome looking spiral plant from the movie Avatar, and I will cover all the geometry node setups and how to generate these individual feathers using a hair system and grooming. I'll also cover the material setup, and I'll give you a little sneak peek into the final jungle scene. The bloom factor can animate the growth on or off. The seed gives you just random variations. You can also adjust the number of rotations up or down, and you can adjust the overall height. If you don't want to make this yourself, you can download this generator from my Gumroad or Patreon. As a Patreon member, you can also access other projects that I've done and all my future projects. I'll also put some behind the scenes stuff as I work on new projects, so check that out. Now let's grow a plant. First, let's make a feather. So call this cube feather. Head into geometry nodes and delete the input. We're going to make a curved line. Z will be 0 and Y will be 5 meters. And that will be our feather. I want a little curve to the feather, so I'm going to set spline type to Bezier, and then set handle positions and just offset it up on the Z-axis, and then duplicate this and set it to the right one. And now we've got a nice little arc. I want to emit hair from this, so it's going to need geometry. So I'm going to first resample curve to give it a little more detail. And then I'm going to do a curve to mesh. And for profile curve, make a curved line. And then set Z to 0 and Y to a very small amount, like negative 0.01. Now let's make our hair system. So go into the particle settings, add a new system, make it hair, make it like 500, and then there's nothing happening. In the source, we need to click use modifier stack, and now we can see our hairs being emitted. I'm going to make them shorter, something like that, and then let's go back into our geometry nodes system. I want to angle my hairs up just a little, so I'm going to add like 0.05 into the X. Nope, that's too much. 0.005. There we go. And now I want to groom these hairs to have a more feather-like appearance. So let's make it big and go to particle edit, and then we go to the top down view. I'm going to make my brush a little bigger, and then I'm just going to angle these hairs forward like so. And then at the tip, one thing is turn off deflect emitter, and it'll make it easier for you. I just want to grab these hairs and make sure that they meet in the middle when we make the other side of our feather. So that's great. And now I need to go to the side view, and I want to add a little curve to these. So I'm going to, first of all, make this flat so it's easier to edit. So I'm just going to turn off these set handle positions, and then go into side view, and suddenly we have more control. Now I just want to brush this up and over like so, and grab the stray hairs so it's got a consistent curve to it. And you may have to fix the front once you do that. So just grab these. It's a process. You can spend as much time as you want making this look good. And then I want a little bulb at the end. I want the end to have a little bulb on it. So I'm going to go to length and I'm going to decrease the size, shrink of these until we have a nice shape at the end. And then I'm going to grow the end a little bit. Something like that. You can spend as much time as you want. Alright, object mode. So we've done our quick groom for these feathers, and now I'm going to add a little more detail to this. So in particle settings, let's go down to children, turn on interpolated, and it'll give you a bunch of extra hairs. All we need is 5, so in both these settings, display and render, just set it to 5. And then in clumping, just turn up the clump value until you get these things meeting at the ends. And now we need the other side of the feather. The easiest way to do this is just duplicate it and scale on the x-axis by -1. And now you've got the other side. But it is completely exactly the same on either side. And one thing you can do to fix that is go into the hair settings, delete edit, change the seed here, and then re-groom it. I'm not going to do that now because it takes time. One last thing, let's go back into geometry nodes and re-enable this so we get our curve back. And now we have a feather. If you look at the original plant in the movie, there are actually 2 layers to the feather, it looks like. One that's shorter, and that adds some depth to it. So I'm just going to make a new collection, call it feather, and then drop these in there. And then I'm going to duplicate this collection and call this feather short. And all we need to do to make the shorter feather is go into the geometry node setup, make it unique, call it feather short, and then right before this resample curve, I'm going to make a trim curve. And that allows us to make it shorter without destroying everything. So I'm just going to make it short enough to be on the back end of this curve here. Right there. And now we just need to go to our other side and use the same one. Now it looks like I need to groom this a little bit so it's not sticking up. So if I just go to particle edit, I can grab these rebellious ones and push them down below. One more thing about the feathers is I don't want this center thing to render, so I'm just going to go into particle settings. Under render, uncheck show emitter, and we can do that in the viewport as well. And then we just have to do that for the other ones. Now let's make our spiral. So first, duplicate a feather. Move it out of the feather collection and call it Helicoradian. And then we can just disable the feathers in our viewport, which will hide them in viewport, but it still allows it to render. I've duplicated a feather, that way all the object data is there for it to render hair as hair. For some reason that was necessary. But we can get rid of this particle system now. And then let's make this geometry nodes unique and call it Helicoradian. And I will now delete everything. And let's make a spiral. Great, we're done. We made a spiral. It's that easy. I want it to start out maybe 0.1 meters wide, or I want it to end at like 0.1 meters and start out like 0.2 meters wide maybe. We can adjust that later. I'm going to change the resolution to 100 and rotations to 4. Now I want to instance my feathers on this spiral. So make an instance on points. And for the instance, we're going to drag our feather collections in. And then join geometry. And plug that into instance. Now we've got a bunch of feathers, but we need to align these to the spiral. So we're going to make a tangent node and an align Euler to vector in the vector socket. And then the axis we want is the y-axis because that's the one our feathers are aligned to. And the pivot is the z-axis because we don't want the pivot to be based on the actual spiral. Plug rotation into rotation, and now we have something happening. I want to angle these up a little bit, so if we make a vector math node, we can just add some on the x-axis, I believe. Now I want to scale these based on the distance along the spiral, and I can use the ID value to do that because the ID on the spiral is going to go from 0 to whatever at the end. So I need to figure out what that ID value is and save it. So I'm going to make a store named attribute node, plug that in here, and then make a attribute statistic. Plug the curve into geometry, and then plug maximum into the value over here. If you hover over this max value, it should show you that what the value will be. And right now it says 0 because we're not grabbing any value. I need to plug an ID node in here. And now it should say 400. That means there's 400 points along this spiral. And we're going to save that maximum value into ID max. Now over here I can use that attribute to drive stuff. So make a scale instances node and then make a named attribute. Start typing ID max, and there it is. And I need to map this value to something with which we can drive scale. It needs to go from 0 to 1 instead of 0 to 400. So I'm going to create a map range node. And the value I want to interpolate is the ID. So let's plug that into the value. And then the max will be our ID max. And now it is interpolating from 0 to 1. So if we plug result into scale, we now have something happening. But it's the inverse of what we want. So if I just plug max into min, that is inverted. And set max to 0. But I don't want it to actually go to a scale of 0, so I'm going to set the minimum result to be 0.2. These are still a little big, so I'm just going to make a vector math node and set it to scale, and then just make that a little smaller till it looks normal. Oh, I do want this plant to be like 4 meters high because they are pretty large in the movie, and then we can adjust our scale accordingly. One other thing I want to do is add some randomness to the scale so it's not so perfect. So I can make a random value node and set the minimum to be like 0.47 and maximum to be 0.475, and then plug that into the scale. Let's adjust this so we can see what it's actually doing. Yep, see, random bits are larger and smaller. Let's add a little noise at the end to just warp it around a little bit and make it look less rigid. So make a noise texture, make a set position, and plug color into offset. And now that's crazy. Turn off normalize. The noise is way too small. And let's duplicate the scale node. Turn the scale down. And then we've got something more reasonable. Now I want to make a stem for this. So I'm going to take this spiral and I'm going to do a curve to mesh. And then I'm just going to take these points and extrude them down on the z-axis. And make it vertices, make it edges instead of faces. And let's Control Shift click so we can see just the result of this. And as you can see, we are extruding it down, so negative on the offset. And then I want to take these extruded points and shrink them into the center. And what I can do is make a set position node and take the original position, which you can use this position node for, and multiply it by a vector. X and Y will be 0 and Z will be 1. That way we're not moving them on the Z position. And now if we just plug that in there, everything disappears. We just need the top though. So click that into selection, and we are now setting those to the center. I want a little more detail on this, so I'm just going to duplicate it a couple times so I get more spirals. So if I just make a repeat zone, which is an awesome addition, plug that in there. And now I'm going to make a set position node and a join geometry node. And you would think you would plug this into here, but that will make duplicates on top of each other. I'll need to join with the original geometry that hasn't been moved. And then if I just set position down on the z-axis a little bit, I get that. And then I can turn up the iterations to have multiple. I do want them to be a bit smaller, so I'm going to make a transform geometry. I guess I could have done it all on this node. And then on the X and Y, I'm going to scale it to like 0.8. There you have it. And then maybe I can move it down the Z a little bit more. Now we've got more detail there. And at the end, I'm just going to join with my feathers before the noise. Just plug that in there. Bloop. And now if I delete my viewer node, for some reason when I merge my geometry with my instanced feathers, the geometry doesn't come through. If somebody knows why that is, let me know in the comments. But I'm just going to do a workaround, and that workaround involves duplicating the Helicoradian and just having the stem as a separate object. So first I'm going to group the spiral because I need to use it in both places. Control G to group, and then just plug that into the output and reconnect this. And call this spiral. Now I'm going to duplicate the Helicoradian, call it stem, and make this unique, call this stem, and then plug the output from my stem directly into the geometry output. And I can add modifiers to this. to affect it individually. I'm going to add a solidify modifier, and the default settings seem to be fine. Now I want to input my stem back into my Helicoradian setup. So drag the stem object in there, and we'll just join that in instead. Let's hide our stem object, and it's still not visible, but if we do geometry to instance, suddenly it is. And all I need to do is move this noise to be applied before we turn the geometry into an instance, because the noise is not applied in the same way. So just duplicate the set position like so. My noise is a little crazy on there, so I'm going to make the scale like 0.5. Now we've got it all in one object again, but we can add whatever modifiers we want on the stem object. I'm just going to do a quick rundown of my material setup. The hair material will be applied to the original feather object, and that needs to be done in a set material node for the feather object. Going into shading, because this material is applied to this original feather object, I can just use the object coordinates. Let me make this big. Along with a wave texture to drive a color ramp that gives us these different gradients of color. I've set this to HSV, and we go from a green color to yellowish to orange or salmon color. Then I'm multiplying it by another texture that makes it darker at the base of the feather. I'm using the principled hair BSDF, and I've adjusted the roughness and radial roughness values to something that seems better. The stem material should be applied to the stem, and that needs to be done in the geometry nodes setup. So if we go here, I just need to make a set material node and grab my stem material. Then I can disable that object, go into rendered view. I need to add this stem material in so I can see it in the shading view. And that stem material is just a basic principled shader with some subsurface, etc. And the orange color kind of matches the feathers. Let's animate this thing. So in the movie it closes really fast when somebody touches it, but I thought it would be cool if I animated it in a way that would look cool opening slowly and then closing. So I'm going to make an animation that can be applied to a bunch of different parameters, so these can scale down and fold up or do whatever, all with one slider. So the first thing I want to animate is the scale of stuff. So I'm going to drag this over to make room, and I'm going to make a group input node. I'm going to duplicate this scale, move it over here, and then I'm going to drag that scale into the group input and call this bloom. I'm going to set the minimum to be 0, maximum to be 1, and the default is 1. So starting at frame 1, I'm going to animate this to be 0, and then at frame 100 it'll be 0.9, and then at frame 130 or 140 it'll be 1. That way it has a nice taper off at the end. And now we have an animation. It looks pretty boring though, so let's add some interest. I want them to start scaling up at the base and then go around in a spiral, offset from each other. And I can do that using the ID of the spiral. So I need to offset the ID with this bloom value because I need that ID selection to slide up in a circle around the spiral. I hope that makes sense. So let's make a named attribute node. Call it ID max. That way we have the maximum. And then I want to multiply the bloom by the maximum. So make a math node. Change it to multiply and plug that in there. The reason we're doing that is because this only goes from 0 to 1, but we need to offset the ID by a value that matches how many of them there are. So now this goes from 0 to 400 instead of 0 to 1. And then if I take the ID, I can duplicate this math node, set it to add, and then I can just add that value to the ID. And now we're selecting the ID based on this bloom animation. So if I take this multiply node and multiply the bloom value by this result, I'm going to get something crazy. And that's because these values are insanely large. But as you can see, as we go up, they get larger. One thing I need to do is invert the ID because the higher values are at the top, but we want the smaller values to be at the top. So map range, and then turn off clamp and just invert these values. So 1, 0. And now we've got something like so. Then I'm going to do another map arrange here because this still looks absolutely insane. We need something that goes from 0 to 1. So make a map arrange node and plug it in after these are added together so we can control the result. Now, I want clamp on so we don't get any values beyond 1, beyond this maximum value. But what I want to do is let the input values go beyond -1. And as I turn this up, we start to see that we get more selection here. So if I make this like negative 100 and this positive 100, we're expanding the areas that are selected. So drag it to what you want, and the real magic happens when you play it back. It took me a minute to figure out why this works, but it's really just you're offsetting the ID that you are scaling. You're offsetting the selection of what you're scaling based on this bloom value, which you have to multiply by something so it can actually offset the ID in a reasonable way. Because an ID goes from 0 to 400 and the bloom value only goes from 0 to 1. Now we can use this same setup to control the rotation. So copy that, put it over here, make some space in the rotation area, and then I'm going to duplicate this add node, and we need to make sure we're affecting the x-axis. So make a combine XYZ, and the x-axis plug vector into vector, and now we're set up. But this isn't giving us the values we want. If I turn off the scale so we can see what rotation is doing, it's kind of the opposite of what we want. So if I add another map range node, we can map this bloom value to what we want. So we want to invert it. So make this 1, make this 0. And now we've got something happening, but they're rotating too far at the beginning. So if we just reduce this down till they're folded up nicely, we now have that unfolding effect. Very satisfying. And then I'll turn on my scale again, and we have this. Now I want the unfolding to happen a little bit later than the scale. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the animation of the bloom within geometry nodes. So for the rotation area, I'm going to make a float curve. and I can just adjust the curve of my animation in here. So I don't want them to grow very fast. I don't want them to fold out until later. So I'm just going to adjust this curve so they start out slowly and then fold out later. So like halfway through the animation, that's when we want them to start folding out. So let's just drag this over even more. Now they start growing on and then folding out. But I do want them to start folding out a little bit. So I'm just going to add another handle here to just get them to start moving. Maybe a little more. Like in this area, I want them to appear to be moving. Now they grow and then fold out at the end. Now I need to adjust the height of the plant as it grows. So duplicate this group input node, and I want to mess with the spiral. This spiral is in two places at once. So what I need to do is take this value and just plunk it inside this group. And I can do that making a value node, and I can just right click, copy as new driver, and then paste driver. Now whatever this value is will be in this node wherever it lives. So we can just go inside this group and use it in there. Oh, it doesn't stay when you copy it. Let's do this again. Paste driver. Now it will be there. And then I want to use this to affect the height. The final height is 4 meters. So like, let's make a map range node and set the max to be 4. Minimum shouldn't be 0. It should be like something small. And then it seems excessively wide. So let's copy this map range node and plug that into start radius. The start radius should end at 0.2 meters. Actually, let's do 0.1. I want it a little thinner. And then start at 0.05. So when we get down here, it's smaller. And then we'll duplicate that and make the end radius even smaller, like a maximum of 0.05 and a minimum of 0.025. I want the height to be smoother, the height growth to be smoother. So let's do a float curve on this one. And we will make it start slow and end slow. And that's much smoother. I want to add another final touch to this for more organicness. When it folds up, I want these guys to get broken up a little bit with some noise. So I'm going to use that in the rotation area. I'm going to make a noise texture node. And then I'm just going to make a math node and add it into this pipe right here. Turn off normalize, and we should just be adding and subtracting values. And now it's a little bit strong, so make a multiply node and turn it down, and then make it a little smaller. And now we've got a nice breakup. And it remains once it opens all the way up, but I want it to go away. So what I can do, let's see, let's make some room, is take my bloom value and multiply my noise by it. But I need the inverse of my bloom value. So map range, we'll invert it so it goes from 1 to 0. And then duplicate a multiply node and multiply that. So now, by the end of our animation, our bloom value has been turned into 0, and it reduces the noise. And I think I can turn it back up a little bit now. I'm noticing some intersecting geometry here. That's caused by the noise, so 0.25 maybe, and a larger noise will cause less of those issues. For my final scene, I used some assets from Adobe Bridge. There were some nice ferns and slightly larger tropical plants that I could use, and those filled out the foreground. And then I found a tree on Sketchfab that's actually free with attribution, and the tree looks great. I just duplicated it all over the place, and I got that background jungle look that I wanted. The butterfly also came off of Sketchfab for free. I just scattered these ferns on the ground using a particle system, and duplicated these Helicoradians around, varying them up slightly. And then for lighting, it's literally just a sky texture with the sun applied, and also a large cube with a volume texture in it, which adds a ton to the ambiance. Let me turn off that volume cube for a moment. Without volume, with volume. It's really expensive to render, but totally worth it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one.